Tonight, the economic chaos caused by Donald Trump's tariffs continue to spook global markets. How can Australia deal with such economic uncertainty? New South Wales farmers want biosecurity, telecommunications and better policies for the environment, discussed in this federal election campaign. And in our Friday forum, Daniel Gillett from the Nationals gives his take on how the coalition's campaign is going, all the way from nuclear to temu Trump. All that and more tonight on Firstline.
This is Firstline with Daniel Pizarro.
Good evening. Those stories in a moment, but first, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has reached out to opposition leader Peter Dutton over a foiled terror plot against the Liberal leader. A 16-year-old Queensland boy has been arrested over allegedly buying bomb-making equipment last year. He fronted the Queensland's Children's Court on Thursday and is committed to stand trial.
It is a fact that the number of threats that have been made to parliamentarians has increased in recent times, and that has been reported on by the appropriate authorities.
Well, Ben, it's a brutal business, there's no question about that. It's the reason my three children have been cured of any interest in politics whatsoever, which Curtin and I see as a small blessing.
Global stock markets have continued to go haywire as the US tariff drama continues. Confusion reigns as US President Donald Trump did a partial backflip, saying almost all countries, with the notable exception of China, will be slapped with the 10% tariff Australia gets for 90 days. Beyond that, it's anyone's guess. Joining me from Perth is Associate Professor Elizabeth Jackson from Curtin University. She's an expert in agribusiness and food supply chain systems. Professor, what has been going on the past week has been something I cannot even really believe what's been happening, because the situation regarding tariffs, the economic situation between Australia and the United States, the effects this is having on our federal election campaign seem to change day by day, hour by hour even. Are you surprised that we are seeing such erratic economic policy coming out of the United States and affecting us here in Australia?
I have to say that Donald Trump has sort of got his own brand of doing things his own way, and I don't think anybody can be surprised by what comes out of the presidency of the United States, but the magnitude of the fallout from what's happened over the last week or so has really been something to behold. We've seen commentators make very, very, very bold statements about the activity of the financial markets. Unprecedented, or we haven't seen this activity since the Great Depression, and that sort of thing. And I think that something with the last time Australia was the victim of tariffs was of course when Scott Morrison was in power, and he had the audacity to question China on where to inquire into China about where the COVID virus came from within Wuhan, and the response was extraordinary tariffs overnight on several Australian primary products, not only agricultural products but mining products as well. And what's interesting is that with that situation, it caused turmoil, but it was a country-to-country situation. What the US presidency is doing now is across multiple countries, and not only a couple, but a massive list of countries. And I equate it to. I've been trying to, particularly being a teacher, I try to sort of visualize and make explanations about this. But what I equate it to, and what I've sort of visualized in my own mind, is imagine a room full of elite chess players, um, going about their business, playing chess, ultra intellectual, pursuits in a competition, high stakes competition, and somebody comes in and upends all their chessboards. They don't know what to do. They don't know whether to start again. They don't know whether to try to pick up where they left off. It is just chaos. And this is for me, this is the best analogy I can see from what has happened over the last few days, because people, the decision makers, really don't know where to turn, because there are so many different moving parts and so many different countries affected at different scales. So if Trump's policy was to create chaos, he has certainly achieved that.
It was fascinating when these tariffs came into effect. The global stock markets essentially went haywire. We saw massive sell-offs from everywhere across the globe. The S&P 500 crashed, had one of its biggest drops ever. The Nasdaq crashed. Then people saw the market rally. Instantly, that reminded me of actually what happened in the Wall Street crash of 1929. It was compared to the dead cat bounce. And it's funny how we now have social media on Twitter. You have these people saying doom and gloom, then the market picks up saying, oh, everything's happy, then it crashes back down. And this was happening hour by hour. We know some forecasters were particularly worried that the US could enter a recession, which could impact us quite greatly, though now that some of these tariffs have been reduced and we have this 90-day 10% for pretty much almost everyone except China, which will last who knows how long this tit-for-tat tariff trade war between those will actually be going through, and the chances of a recession have been reduced a bit. But given the fact that these decisions can have such drastic impacts within a matter of minutes, it makes the situation incredibly concerning and in very many ways very uncertain, because people's livelihoods can be ruined within a matter of minutes.
Yeah, and you're quite right. There was some coverage, a very interesting little case study, some coverage this morning I noticed on the ABC. There was a garment manufacturer in Brooklyn who goes about their business making shirts and exporting them from the US. They put their consignment of shirts on the boat for export. And at the moment, like as in right now, this small business does not know the price that it will gain for its products when that vessel reaches its destination, because of the extreme fluctuation of currency markets and markets in general at the moment. Now, put yourself in the position of that small business. That is terrifying. And while a lot of experts will say, oh, you can do this and you can do that to manage your risk and all the rest of it, those complexities are not necessarily achievable for small business owners. This is a small family business, just like we have in Australia, and to have that outcome is absolutely outrageous. And this is going to be happening all over the world because of these decisions.
And what is your take on this tit-for-tat tariff war between the US and China? Because we now have these tariffs of over 100% on Chinese imports into the US. China's responded. What kind of effect could this have on Australia, either directly or indirectly, because one of our biggest issues that we've been looking at now as a way to mitigate these tariffs for particularly like the beef industry, our agricultural products here in the New England Northwest, has been to look at our emerging and other current markets. So the Northern African area, Middle East, but also areas like Japan and China and Korea, which are really keen for our Australian beef.
And this is an excellent question. So let me start from a global perspective. And it seems that it's so interesting to watch from the sidelines on this, because it seems that countries are now not only looking at resilience in terms of resilience of manufacturing and transport and so on and so forth, but they're now also looking at the concept of the uncertainty and the unreliability when it comes to global leaders as well. So, during COVID, we all got a fright because we realised that all of, particularly for Australia, so much of our products that we enjoy on a day-to-day basis come from China. And we really hit the panic button. Everyone in so many countries in the world hit the panic button and said, right, we've got to stop this. We've got to stop this, putting all our eggs in one basket. And big companies like Apple, for example, they didn't take their business away from China, but they spread it out. They spread it out amongst Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam and South Korea, just to mitigate that manufacturing risk. But now that manufacturing risk has turned into leadership risk of countries that are just difficult to deal with because they've got leadership issues. Now, coming back to Australia. So the beef industry, for example, in Australia is extremely interesting at the moment because, one of the points you mentioned earlier is the idea that we've got this federal election going on, coming up, which is making things more complex in Australia. But also we mustn't forget the floods in Queensland, and I see the floods in northeast South Australia now, that are going to be reducing the amount of beef that we've got available on the global, to service the global market. Last I heard, which was probably 10 days ago, there was more than 150,000 head of livestock in Queensland that had been unaccounted for because of the floods. So where are we going to, the first question is, where are we going to access this beef from? Are processors, because don't forget, we've got to take a supply chain perspective on this. Do we have the road transport facilities to move these? If we can find these cattle, do we have the road transport facilities that haven't been washed away or damaged to move them? And how the other question to us is how is the processing sector coping with this? And what's really interesting about how Australia deals with these types of disruptions is that we always find a way. Every member of that supply chain that I mentioned, the farmers, the road transporters, the processors, they always find a way to work around these disruptions. But they are the questions we've got to get fundamental in our minds before we start looking for new markets. But then again, new markets are always welcome, no matter what, no matter what the circumstances.
And I know, particularly in WA, you had the continuing controversy over live exports. Over here in the east, of course, they've been banned, and there's been the various discussions of that impact on the New England Northwest for our beef and sheep exporters to the Middle East. You've also had the same issues regarding live export, and we know how important the Middle East market has been, even though that area has been so volatile for decades upon decades. And we've, of course, got the current Israel-Hamas war at the moment, followed by the various tensions involving Syria, Iran, Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, that's an area that can also be a powder keg as well, meaning that Australia, we have to look at even more different markets, which is why Northern Africa is starting to become a very popular area for the New South Wales Farmers Organisation to really see that we could make a brilliant new economic connections with those Northern African.
Absolutely. I know Jordan, for example, has been very interested in taking live sheep from Western Australia. Saudi Arabia has been interested in taking live sheep from Western Australia. Of course, we've got the regular challenges, about cultural preferences, availability of cold storage in our customer countries. So that's one issue, but the situation in North Africa is definitely something to the Middle East and South North Africa, I beg your pardon, is something to watch. We do have to, in that respect, we do have to keep in mind freight prices. Freight prices are okay at the moment, but with what's happened with global markets over the last few days, heaven only knows what's going to happen to global freight prices now. Availability of containers is another issue. So we've just got to be very mindful, because Australia prides itself on the quality, particularly of the quality of the livestock that it produces. Its safety, it's like I said, it's repeatable quality, and we get used to servicing high value markets, and our production systems have been such that we are servicing high value markets, whereas those North African markets aren't quite so high value, and also our products have got a long way to travel to get there.
They certainly do. One aspect I've also been looking at this global trade war is not just between the US and almost every country it's slapping on these tariffs, but also these other countries could say, okay, we need to do more economic protectionist theories. We're going to just have tariffs across the board from every single country. So essentially, countries upon countries will be putting tariffs on everyone else and then the whole global trade market could be completely and utterly disrupted, and we could find a lot of exports for Australia not being able to go anywhere because everyone's placing tariffs on everything, and we might have to face, okay, will we have to put tariffs now? Do you think that could be a possible situation, like worst case scenario?
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking worst case scenario. You took the words out of my mouth, and it seems that at this point in time, anything is possible. I mean, I have been shocked beyond description about the sizes of the tariffs we're talking about out of China. I mean, more than 100%. I mean, it's absurd, and the outcome that is going to have is the fact that, in this case, American consumers are just not going to have the variety and the cheap or the low price of products that come from China. It's all it's very interesting as to make America great again, and create all this in-house manufacturing. But where is that going to come from, and who's going to do it? For example, if anyone in this country is recently, trying to build a house, for example, you'll know how difficult it is to get materials. And that's just to build a house, let alone a factory. So there's the establishment costs of factories. There's upgrades to transport infrastructure that have to come on. This isn't something that is achieved overnight. And so this impending trade war of I'll hit you with a tariff because you've hit me with a tariff is getting into very, very, very dangerous territory. And it's all very well and good for I recall Donald Trump quoting yesterday, which was probably the day before for them, the US government is earning $2 billion a day from this. Well, great, but that's not going to build you a factory overnight. That's not going to allow, very low cost manufacturing, and like I said, the variety of products that all consumers have had the luxury of having access to over the last 30 or 40 years since the concept of supply chain management has come into play.
And interestingly, here in Australia, of course, the federal Labor government has the Future Made in Australia policy. We've got the Minister, Labor's duty senator for New England is actually Senator Tim Ayres, and he's really been pushing for the Future Made in Australia project, essentially, with ranging from manufacturing, investment, renewables, these things that he's really been pushing, because he has said to me earlier that we do rely on too many imports and not being able to create our own industries, especially for those more scarce minerals that we might have to import from China, but also the associated costs for having things constructed overseas and then being brought in, like various renewable energy projects as well. Do you think that as a way to possibly mitigate the situation with these tariffs is to try and insulate ourselves by getting as much domestic production and industries as well? I know Barnaby Joyce mentioned that last week when it came to the beef industry, we should focus on the domestic market to try and mitigate some of the worst effects of these tariffs.
Yeah, and the short answer is yes, absolutely, 100%. It is the solution. However, the solution isn't a perfect solution, because the outcome of the possibly unintended consequence of such a plan, and I am genuine in saying it is a great idea, and it is something that we do need to build our resilience, our national resilience on. Absolutely, and I say that from the bottom of my heart. However, as a population, in the pursuit of achieving that ambition, what we will see is we will see an increase in prices, because we have been able to and possibly even inconvenience when it comes to the lifestyle that we have become accustomed to in the last, say, 30 or 40 years, perhaps being a bit more generous, say in the last 10 or 15 years. We have, as consumers, we have been able to access such low-cost products, consumer products, leaf blowers, for example, garden furniture, furniture for your home, clothes, all these consumer products. We have been able to enjoy them at lower prices than ever before, in greater variety than ever before, because of what has happened with globalization. Supply chains have been able to provide us with this lifestyle. If we come back, if we pull back from that and we start manufacturing in Australia, yes, we will create jobs. Yes, we will create industry, which is absolutely fantastic. But our costs of doing business here are significantly higher than they are in places like Asia and Southeast Asia. And we've also got the establishment costs as well of setting up manufacturing plants in this country, which we used to have, but we don't have anymore. So we're going to have to, there are going to be establishment costs associated with that. So while this onshore manufacturing goal is of course the right thing to do, it is of course going to preserve our national resilience, but it is going to come at a cost, and I think people have to be aware of that, and again, be prepared to rein back from that, particularly that variety of products that we've become so used to having access to.
And Professor Jackson, how have you felt about this federal election campaign, especially we've just had a surprise budget because the election was delayed because of ex-tropical cyclone Alfred. Jim Chalmers has announced that the various policies, including that tax cut, as well as various billion-dollar projects, although with a lot of restrained spending. This wasn't a massive blowout to try and entice voters. Then we had Peter Dutton's budget response, which didn't go down well, particularly over possible 41,000 job cuts to the APS, as well as investing in gas, and of course controversy over how much his nuclear policy would be costing. Now we're in the federal election itself, and there's been a lot of pressure on the coalition for their proper costings, also how the Australian economy is going to be doing over the next couple of years, and we seem to be plodding along okay. But given that we've had these global shocks, how vulnerable are we, and what kind of effects is this having on our election campaign?
Well, I'd say that there's no one more fatigued with the election campaign than Western Australians, because of course we had our state election only just recently, so a state election has been followed in very quick succession with a federal election. Of course, my particular area of interest is agri-food supply chain systems, and I think one of the points that has been raised for ministerial consideration coming into this election is the insecurity, what do you call it, the unconsidered issue of food security for this country. There's been a green paper put out by Andrew Henderson on this issue, and it's very, very, very timely. I don't think it could have been released in any more timely fashion with what's happening with tariffs at the moment. But Australia, despite the surface good news story that we are, as a nation, self-sufficient in food, the fact of the matter is that our agricultural economy and other economies within this country, for example, mining as well, rely on several inputs that are imported: diesel, fertilizer, chemicals, and machinery. Without those inputs, we do not have agriculture in Australia, and particularly in Western Australia with our ancient depleted soils. Without those inputs, we do not have agriculture in this country. And so we need to be very, very, very protective and very mindful of where those of the shipping lanes and our access, our global access to those key inputs, because, like I said, without those 4 inputs, we are not self-sufficient in food. We've probably got enough stocks, no problem at all. But when it comes to fresh food, particularly fresh fruit and veg, which are and grains, which are the real cornerstone of human nutrition, of course, meat is absolutely essential. But those the fresh fruit and vegetables, we don't have agriculture without these inputs, and this green paper has highlighted that considerably, and it's something that the election the election needs to consider. But the broader election, it's very interesting to see the people who are undecided at present, and I fully understand their situation, because there's an awful lot going on at the moment, and the likelihood of promises that are made today for election campaigns are they're more precarious than ever. People, the critics in the room are always sceptical of promises that are made pre-election. But I tell you what, no time like now for those pre-election promises to fall by the wayside. With the global situation changing as fast as it does and is.
And very briefly, Professor Jackson, do you think the penguins on Herod Island and the people of Norfolk Island can at least rest a little bit easier over the very, very bizarre tariffs that are being put upon them? I'm sure the penguins are very unhappy about the situation.
Absolutely. The poor old penguins, what did they do? They go about their business, swimming in the ocean, catching fish, having babies. They're just the perfect circular economy, and they were slapped with 10% tariffs themselves through no fault of their own. And when our Trade Minister, John Farrell, came out and because it had pulled on his heartstrings about the poor old penguins, I have to say how social media went wild on that, and even I keep seeing new memes and new gifs or whatever they're called coming up, and and I think what is to me something that's new with this crisis, perhaps that we could say we're in, is people having a joke as well, and having a laugh from what's happening, which I think human nature is very important. But yes, the poor old penguins and the seals as well, and all the little animals on these uninhabited human islands. Well, at least they've got their 90-day reprieve.
They certainly do. We'll have to see what happens next. Professor Elizabeth Jackson, thank you so much for your time.
An absolute pleasure, Daniel. Thank you for the opportunity.
This federal election is one where the New South Wales Farmers Organisation is demanding action on biosecurity, telecommunications, and what the group's president, Xavier Martin, calls practical solutions for the environment. Speaking from Mudgee on a rather patchy connection earlier this week, Mr Martin also called for the Bureau of Meteorology and farmers to work closer together on providing better forecasts, as he claims the bomb has an agenda. Well, Mr Martin, thank you so much for joining us. It looks like it's a very windy day out there in Mudgee. How is it?
Yes, it's just getting a bit of dust to rise, and unfortunately, it's only really a green tinge in this part of Australia, this part of the state, and they'll certainly need more rain to be in reasonable shape for the winter, and they'll need it ASAP because the chill in the air says that Jack Frost isn't far around the corner.
And how have you actually found this previous season? Because you and I have discussed about the drought resilience, drought protection over the past couple of months, and you've of course been very cautious about how the potential weather effects have been, ranging from El Nino to La Nina. We've had the devastating floods recently from all the various cyclones at the moment. How are you feeling about the forecast at the moment?
Well, as I've travelled around the state, I've been able to listen to our members at 40 or more branches so far, and there is still considerable apprehension about not just the forecast, but the patchy nature of how the season's panned out and how it's anticipated to continue. Certainly, we've seen polarities between the northeast with its deluge and the southwest with serious drought conditions. Really, once you get south and west of Griffith, it really goes off quite dramatically, and a lot of the rest of the state quite variable. So look, to the extent that farmers are watching and listening to forecasts, although probably less listening to forecasts than they used to, I'm hearing our members say more and more that they see the Bureau of Meteorology as an activist group rather than a scientific group. The reality is that they'll deal with the reality, deal with that risk, deal with that weather when it turns up, and that's what farmers are good at. They're good at managing the risk, and they're doing their best.
And based on what you just said, what do you mean that they believe that the Bureau of Meteorology is an activist group?
Little over 18 months ago, El Nino was the strong forecast, and they came out and they caused near panic with destocking, and a lot of farmers trusted them. And of course, there was nothing like that. It just rained and rained and rained. And yeah, it was just, I think a lot of farmers are saying to me that they saw that there was this concept of, global boiling and El Nino, and it's all going to happen, this summer. And of course it didn't. We had a cool, wet summer.
So would you want to see the Bureau of Meteorology and farmers work better closely together so they can understand the forecast, how the modelling is done, where the whole experience and how like everything from storm tracking to forecast predictions, and how farmers also see their own area? Would you like to see more of that collaboration?
Oh, look, absolutely. Members want to see things improve. They'd just like to see the Bureau stick to the science rather than, activism about what might be happening around weather variations or climate change or what have you. I mean, they're flat out getting it right 4 days out. So there's not much point in them trying to pretend they know what's going on 40 or 400 days out. And yeah, unfortunately, they fell into that trap when, as members said to me, they forecasted El Nino and they went and destocked sheep and cattle.
Now, Mr. Martin, we know over the past couple of days, it has been very uncertain for every one of your members as Donald Trump has announced these tariffs for Australia, 10% and bizarrely 27% for Norfolk Island, and even higher for the uninhabited Herid Islands where there's no one except penguins. So I don't know how much trading we actually have with penguins in the United States with Australian territories. But how, at the moment, have your members been feeling about the potential impacts about these tariffs to America?
Well, look, members I've spoken to, and bearing in mind I've only been to a few meetings since the announcement by President Trump, those members seem to be pretty calm and observant, and they are pleased to hear that the agricultural industry, the whole sector, is working closely with the Australian government to use every diplomatic tool we can to resolve this issue. There is a wide school of thought that we've had a couple of decades of benefiting from free trade, although there's been a predilection for a lot of non-tariff barriers to be introduced. So even though we might have seen upfront tariffs reduced over the decades, non-tariff barriers have vastly increased. And in fact, we're accused by the US of having our own non-tariff barrier in relation to our biosecurity rules. But of course, we all know as an island nation trying to protect our clean, green sector, and we have got at least 1,000 pests and diseases that are in the rest of the world that are not here. And if we're not careful, well, we need to be a lot more careful because we're losing the battle 2, 3, even 4 pests and diseases a month on month, year on year. So if we're going to maintain our biosecurity status, we've got to stick to it, not see it compromised by tariffs.
And of course, one of the biggest concerns that we've had that we've been speaking to is being red imported fire ants. And you and I have been seeing all the efforts to prevent those ants getting into the New England Northwest, because if they got into that, not only could our entire food bowl be completely disrupted or destroyed, we could have animals or even people being killed by these invasive pests.
Oh, look, they are one of the very worst exotic pests that has got into this nation and got established in southeastern Queensland. It's a really good example of the contrast, if you like, between farmers and their resilience around weather and even adapting to changing market conditions like tariffs. Farmers are tough and will get up, pull their boots on and get on with the job. But if their whole efforts are compromised by disease and pests like fire ants, then it becomes impossible. And certainly to the extent those fire ants, if they become established widespread in this nation, they will change our flora, our fauna, and they'll change our way of life. So, when it comes to trying to respond to these 10% tariffs, we'll be making sure that we stick by our biosecurity rules, because that's what keeps this island, this nation safe.
Our answer to look at possibly other markets. I know that you have been looking at places like Northern Africa, of course, Asia, like South Korea and Japan, China, and also the Middle East. Are those the areas that we could really benefit from and have our exporters be able to find new markets and continue to enhance their financial stability?
I think it's very likely that as we speak, there's significant efforts going on to find alternative markets, premium markets. And look, we saw that recently with the imposition of punitive tariffs from the Chinese Communist government, just, saying, because we asked about where COVID came from, deciding that beef and barley, wasn't it, and lobsters and wine, they just chose them to impose tariffs on, and we went and found other markets, and I'm sure the same will be happening to weigh up the merit of what's going on in the USA. But at the end of the day, 10%, we see 10% in our GST, and if you're an exporter of John Deere tractors, you probably think, well, they come from the US and they get 10% put on them for GST. So I don't think we need to get too seriously concerned about it. We just need to be patient and watchful, continue our Australian resilience, and use our experience to adapt to these changing market conditions.
And finally, how are you feeling about this federal election campaign? Do you think that the major issues that you're wanting to talk about, not just the tariffs and biosecurity, also drought resilience, these kind of things have been adequately discussed between candidates and current MPs and senators?
Oh, they absolutely have not been adequately discussed and committed to, and we're putting it openly to both sides that we want practical and long-term funding for biosecurity from the risk creator, not from those that are copying the risk. We want smarter and practical policies for our rural environment, and we want improved connectivity infrastructure. We've had our mobile phone coverage just switched off for 6 months now. It's just a disaster across the nation for rural people trying to work alone and staff working alone, and we can't even get SOS. We also want the good decisions to be made in relation to the future of farming. We've got a whole lot of reasons why foreigners have been banned from purchasing housing. We need the same thing for 2 years for farming, because we've got all these tax avoiding foreign entities that are buying farmland and water and cutting out the next generation of Australian farmers. So we need a whole lot of meaningful reforms on trade and business. Our agricultural workforce is really, significantly stressed at the moment. We need way better rules around that. So we need both the coalition and the Labor Party to make commitments that stack up for this federal election.
And we also have the controversial water buybacks, which have been a continuous sticking point for you and your members as well.
Oh, well, I include them under the practical policies for the environment, because at the moment what we're copying is theory. The rationale that we could tip 50 Sydney harbours of fresh water out into the salt every year, and somehow that'd be better if we did 51, bought another Sydney harbour of fresh water with taxpayer money and tipped it out into the salt. It's just a nonsense. If any of the decision makers went and looked at the degrading effect it's having on the rivers, where the banks are continually wet and slumping and the century-old trees are just diving in from both sides, the penny might just start to drop that the theory is not translating into practice.
And finally, Mr. Martin, how are you feeling about the New England Northwest region at the moment? There's, of course, a lot of investment, a lot of people coming into these areas. We have various projects from renewables to farming to all kinds of university investments, a new campus coming to Tamworth from UNE. What's your thoughts on our region?
Oh, look, it's good to see that investments are being made. I think that, again, we've got to be very wary of the theory behind some of them rather than the practicalities, because when the taxpayer dollars are involved, often there's a headlong charge to spend money, and when we stop and think about it, we'll realise that it may not have been thought through as well as it ought to have been. And so whether it's bricks and mortar or renewables, all those things must be well planned, practically planned, or else we're going to regret spending that money.
Xavier, Martin, thank you very much for joining me here on Firstline, and enjoy the sunny, windy weather out in Mudgee. As we mark the end of week 2 of the federal election campaign, the opposition are once again on the back foot. Peter Dutton dumped his highly unpopular policy of forcing public servants who are currently working from home back to the office. And he claims the 41,000 public service jobs he wants cut by 2030 won't be butchered by an axe. Though Liberal spokesperson James Patterson did say that there would be voluntary redundancies, despite that not being said by Mr Dutton earlier this week. Meanwhile, a YouGov poll release claims Labor have increased their lead over the coalition on the two-party preferred vote, the government on 52.5% to the opposition's 47.5%, a drop in support for the Liberals and Nationals being blamed on those two policies. Here in the New England, the campaign continues as Nationals MP Barnaby Joyce aims for re-election. To discuss how the Nationals are faring, I was joined early in the studio by Daniel Gillett, chairperson of the Federal Electoral Commission for the New England Nationals, for our Friday forum. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. We are halfway through this campaign, and first I would have to say this has not been a great campaign so far run by the coalition. We've had quite a few backflips from Peter Dutton, and they seem to be just losing momentum. And I think the point where they started losing was when the Reserve Bank lowered the interest rates. And that started to give the federal government with Anthony Albanese that bit of an edge. And so far, they've been campaigning, not massively amazingly, but have been staying out of trouble compared to the coalition. How have you found the coalition's campaign so far?
I think that things will shift a lot during this campaign. So the key things that we know this election was always going to be about were cost of living and safety and security, and also defence. And I think that a lot of people expected there to be a very huge gap between the two parties. Now, we know that prior to the election there was a lot of talk about energy and how we're going to see differences there. I don't think we've seen either party's full spread of policies yet either. It's become very trendy in recent elections to leave your campaign launch until quite late, and of course with Treasury costing both sides of the major parties anyway, those things tend to be announced quite late in the piece. The other thing, I guess, that comes into how the campaign started is, of course, the coalition didn't get to choose when it started, and there was some very canny political veterancy in the way that the election was called. So, of course, we had a budget, and then the budget reply speech, and not even 12 hours after the budget reply speech was given, the writs were issued for the election. So that's probably affected the beginning of the campaign. Having said that, I think that over the course of this week in which we're filming, we're seeing the first of those debates, and we've also seen debates between the Treasurer and the Shadow Treasurer, and we've also seen debates between the Minister for Energy and his respective shadow, and those are the things that people really start to gravitate towards. When you're in journalism or when you're in politics, you know, we love polling and we love to look at that stuff, but really what people look at is what people say when they're in those debates and in those forums and how it makes them feel. And I think that you're right, there have been some changes in policy, and it has appeared a little bit maybe more confused, But there have been some really interesting things that have happened in the last 2 weeks. And at this point, I think I'd put the major parties probably neck and neck in terms of how they've been received and how they've made people feel this early in the campaign.
The reason why I'm become very sceptical of the coalition at the moment is, first, we did have this implication that Peter Dutton was trying to tie himself as a Donald Trump-esque type of a politician, not in necessarily in all the policies, but that type of personality, that more strongman style. You know, as you say, the coalition's one of their big claims, of course, is being strong on defence, and they can really hammer Labor with that. But then we started to hear the name Temu Trump being battered about, and we've seen how the recent tariffs have had a massive impact on the confidence of Australian farmers, especially here in the New England, where a lot of people are concerned. And there's been this situation where some people have claimed that Peter Dutton could have avoided any tariffs or any implications with Donald Trump. We know at the moment that probably wouldn't have been true regardless. Donald Trump is a very erratic, very self-centered person. And to be tied with someone like that, Peter Dutton has found himself on, in many ways, the back foot when it came to kind of similar policies. We had this infamous Doge comparison with the government efficiency reviews under what if Jacinda Price becomes a minister. We also had him going after considered things like woke and all that. And when I see the reaction from a lot of people, not just online, but how they react to these policies, they're just saying, this is not what we want to talk about. This is not what we are doing. For me, it seems like there's this bit of a disconnect between coalition MPs and candidates and the general populace of Australia. What's your take?
So I think there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing is that I think the comparisons between Mr. Dutton and Mr. Trump are mainly being made by the people who can benefit from those comparisons. And they are people who sit opposite them in the chamber, and also people who benefit from having a good story, with the greatest of respect to the journalists of the world. I think equally you can say, well, Mr. Albanese is often compared to somebody who is a lot softer than Donald Trump. And I don't think any of those comparisons really work in an Australian context. One of the things that I've always disliked about the more recent elections, and I think we can probably go back as far as the Tony Abbott versus Julia Gillard election. I think that's where I first really noticed it, is this idea that voters in Australia are choosing between prime ministers. And that's just not how our system works. No. So you and I, for example, we don't get to vote for either Mr. Albanese or Mr. Dutton. And we certainly don't get to vote for Mr. Trump. We don't have a presidential system. We have a parliamentary system.
No. The campaigns have typically become very presidential since the 1970s. We had, of course, Gough Whitlam being front and centre with its time. Neville Wran, of course, very famously was a very presidential style of candidate during an election. But, of course, as a premier and head of government with a parliamentary system, he wasn't I have the whole say over everything. But a lot of these campaigns are in many ways focusing on those personalities, even though everyone says, we prefer policies and all that. A lot of it has focused on the personalities of the candidates, and especially now the leaders, regardless of our parliamentary system.
I think that you're right. I think the campaign's focus has shifted a lot. And I don't think that is necessarily the best way for people to decide how to vote. So again, I would look to, how did the policies of the people who are seeking to represent you make you feel? That's what you should be looking at. So let's talk about the tariffs, for example. And we saw just today, when we're filming, there was a back down from Mr. Trump on those tariffs. President Trump has essentially now put everybody on a 10% tariff except China. Yeah. Now, China has the whip hand here. Honestly, China is functionally, depending on how you measure it, not in terms of GDP yet, but in terms of PPP, China is a much larger economy already than the United States.
And how it also ties in with all the other economies around the world, not just in East Asia. We know one of the biggest concerns that we've had has been regarding the potential almost near collapse of the Chinese housing market, how that would have affected our iron ore exports from the Pilbara. There's also been all these interesting little tidbits of if China starts to soften or weaken or experiences a collapse, then that will impact us, and then that can expand across the entire world. And it's like, and when China starts to slow down, you're thinking, okay, something's going to happen here, and we have to maybe put a buffer between any disasters and see what we could still do with the Chinese economy.
The Chinese economy, though, they have more levers to pull, for example, than a free market economy has. So have a look at how they reacted to the tariffs. They immediately imposed reciprocal tariffs, and then they devalued the yuan because they can do that, which means that the goods that had been tariffed were not going to be as expensive for people who wanted to buy them. They're also able to control the flow of critical minerals out of their country. They just stopped exporting them to the US. And it only took a few days for President Trump to back down from everybody else. Now, tariffs are, in my opinion, dreadful economic policy. I think that Mr. Trump is receiving some very poor economic advice. And I think that at the end of the day, we'll see that this is an act of self-harm. However, what it showed us was that China has the whip hand, and that's something that Australia needs to be thinking about. We don't want to become a vassal economy of China. They're a very important trading partner for us, but we need to make sure that that trade is conducted on a free and fair basis, and that we don't disadvantage anybody else by being in partnership with China. So to come back to this idea of what should we learn from the way that President Trump's antics, if you want to think about them that way, are affecting our campaign. Honestly, I'd prefer we just focus on domestic policies. However, there's something really interesting in the way that people reacted to those tariffs and in the way that we often react to policies here in the regions. And that is, well, why are we being treated with a blanket when clearly we should be having a different policy applied to us? So Australia copped a 10% tariff.
Except for the Herald Islands. The Penguins, of course, seem to have copped even more, and then Norfolk Island also copped a 27% tariff.
Yeah, which makes very little sense. Right?
Yes.
So, and when you look at the maths behind it, there's some interesting things. That there's some confusion in the political aficionados systems over there in the US. They essentially look at a trade deficit and think that equates to a tariff. We don't think that way. Nobody else in the world thinks that way either. And I don't think that the President of the United States is going to think that way for very much longer because of the way his own people are reacting and the way that the bond market is reacting. Ultimately, that will force his hand. If the US economy gets into a position where they're unable to refinance their debt, which is quite large, then they won't be able to maintain this policy. It's just maths. It won't take that long.
And they keep trying to always talk about issues like raising the debt ceiling, which has been something they've talked about for decades, and it's been risen and all that.
They can't do that if the bond market stays the way it is at the moment. So that's what I mean, is that they don't have any cards left to play here, and really they've gone out quite early. But how did it make people feel? It made us as Australians, it made us as Australians feel like we were being treated not as friends, not as somebody who had a special relationship, not as somebody who was a close ally. And if you look at the differences between the offerings of the major parties in Australia, and we saw today a really important step from David Littleproud, who announced essentially the return of the Building Better Regions Fund. It will have a different name, but that was something that had been put into place by the previous coalition government, and then it was taken away by Labor. Now what we'll see, there's a commitment to $1 billion of infrastructure spend through a competitive grants process that will happen year on year, and that there will be money set aside for that. So it's a perpetual investment in the regions. And that's not something that a Labor government would do. And so the way that we all as Australians felt when we were treated just the same as everybody else by a US president, that very much, in my mind, equates to how it felt as somebody who chooses to live in regional Australia, being told, no, you don't get the same infrastructure benefits, the same educational opportunities, the same health safety nets as people who live in the city because we're not prepared to acknowledge the differences. We're just going to treat everybody with the same brush. And that's a very interesting thing to observe, I think, as in terms of how the campaign's going.
Also, the reason I think one of the big problems that Peter Dutton has had, particularly this year, were the very controversial push for returning all those public servants who were working from home. He did a big backflip on that earlier this week. Which
is a good decision, right? Because it wasn't a popular policy. Yes. And I think when the scope of who that would affect was fully realised, he decided, okay, this is a bad idea. I'm not going to stick with this. And we can call it a backflip, or we can call it listening to people when they say, hey, that's not a good idea. I mean,
depends on which side of politics you're looking at it too, because everyone will try to spin it. The other thing, of course, was there's, I think, still a bit of some confusion over the fate of the 41,000-ish public servants. This was, of course, incredibly unpopular when Peter Dutton announced it in the budget reply. And one of the things that we know is there had been discussions about exactly where these jobs would be potentially going. Someone tried to say that it would only happen in Canberra, which would be completely impossible to happen. And there had been fears last year of public service jobs in the New England being gone. So the question, of course, would be to put to Mr. Barnaby Joyce is, if someone's in the public service and their job is potentially on the line, why on earth would they want to vote for the Nationals at that time? And Peter Dutton has tried to clarify to degree, saying, it's not going to be slashing, cutting with an axe or that, it's more redundancies or not filling replacements and all that. However, we still had the controversies over those previous contractors that filled those positions during the Morrison government time. So it seems that there's the potential problems that we could have with the previous coalition government resurfacing again. And one of the biggest issues is that out here in the regional areas, we rely even more heavily on those public service workers to make sure that some of our bureaucracy is being continuing. And there's a lot of people concerned that they might find they would not have access to a person or an organisation more easily under a coalition government compared to Labor. And we know like all the complaints about being on phone with Centrelink for several hours and all that, getting rid of even more public service jobs and making it even more problematic, that could also be a detriment, if you understand what I mean.
So I think there's two parts to what you're saying. The first is the question of whether the public service has bloated, and I think that we definitely need to take a look at that because it has certainly grown a lot in the last 3 years. It's grown quite dramatically. So is it bloated? It's at least worth a look. I'd suggest that there is probably the opportunity to allow, through attrition, I think is what you were trying to say, that you would not necessarily replace some of those jobs. And it could be that those jobs are better taken up in the private sector. That's always been the tension between the Labor and the coalition, if you like, is that we think there are some things that are better done in the private sector and there are other things that are better done by the public sector. But to go to your commentary, I guess, about the public service jobs here in the New England electorate, well, it was under the coalition government that we saw a growth in the decentralisation of the public service, and that's something that's been a long time in coming. So, for example, the APVMA moving to Armidale, that brought a public service to the regions where it belongs, and under a Labor government, we've no doubt that we'll start to see that stripped away. You can also look at the state government who are doing similar things. They have essentially folded up the Department of Primary Industries into one of these new mega departments. And we see that there are inefficiencies in this system. We also see this in the health system. Again, it's related more to the states, but the larger health service areas are becoming quite inefficient. And we hear reports of that all the time, both from inside and outside the system.
And Hunter New England Health is one of the most criticised of the local health districts at the moment. And at the moment, we have this inquiry into possibly splitting the service up again.
Well, a lot of people have talked about that. And look, I have a conflict of interest speaking about that, so I won't go into detail, but it certainly has been a question that's asked very often. So those sorts of investigations into how the public service operates, I think they're quite healthy and quite normal. I don't think there's anything that I've seen in terms of the coalition's plan to reduce the level of public service that I would consider apocalyptic at this stage. And it's easy to beat it up, but functionally, I think the public service has probably become a little too bloated, and it wouldn't hurt to have a look at what could be better served by the private sector.
Let's move on to our local candidates for New England. We have 5 candidates.
Yeah.
Of course, the incumbent, Barnaby Joyce, he has a margin of about 66% of the two-party preferred vote, 52% on the primary vote alone. His main challenger, of course, is Laura Hughes, Labor Party, and she is certainly gunning for this seat, despite the massive Everest-sized challenge that she does face. We also have the Greens, we have One Nation, and the reconstituted Family First Party. But the big thing, of course, no high-profile independent this time. And the big question, and you and I were speaking about this off air, is where will that independent vote go to? Who will be most likely to be able to sweep up, especially as we've also got now the new people from Muswellbrook and Scone in this electorate at the same time. So it has reduced Barnaby Joyce's margin slightly. And the question now is, will he have to resort to preferences to retain that seat? And it will be all dependent on all these other candidates. How are you feeling, especially as we thought we were going to have Natasha Ledger, but she hasn't put her name up this time, despite me speaking to her last week saying that she was going to do it.
Yeah, and so, look, I'll go to the last part of your question first. I hope Natasha's doing really well. I've not spoken with her either. Natasha has been a candidate at a number of elections on which I've campaigned recently, the last state election, and she was a councillor up in Uralla for a long time. So I hope that she's doing okay. And she certainly brings a lot of colour and a very unique perspective on things to the campaigns when she's there. I think that it is probably just a case of resources, and that's often what these election campaigns come down to. They are about how many volunteers you have, about how many fundraisers you're able to rely on. So maybe that's where Natasha was unable to find that commitment from other people in the community.
She did hint at that last week when I spoke to her, and asking for crowdfunding, and it's and given that also her vote, depending on which election she was in, and then comparing to her votes in the federal election, it has varied from a couple of percentage points and that. So it does wax and wane, particularly for her. But she's not been the big high-profile independent. We had Matt Sharpen last time, who got a significant percentage of that vote, and it looked like that if Natasha was going to be able to run, she could claim that she's the independent. But the question, of course, is whether or not voters would flock to her was severely under question.
Yeah. So look, I guess, and this relates to the first part of your question, one of the things that I've learned from Mr. Joyce over the years, seeing him campaign, and going all the way back to 2013, there are two things that are really important. You never take for granted what the electors are going to decide, and they are very, very smart. The electorate knows very well what they're doing, and they know who they're voting for, and they all have different reasons for putting their preference where they do. I think sometimes we put too much emphasis on how to vote cards, and we think that people are going to follow them to the letter or to the number, I guess.
Or even people think that it's the candidates themselves that decide where preferences go.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of misconception about that too. So what I've learned from Mr. Joyce is you never take it for granted, and I see him working very, very hard, harder than any other candidate I know, and he'll be doing that every day right up until the 3rd of May. So he's not taking for granted that he has a high margin, or that he has the ability to hold on to that with or without preferences. That's not even in his mind. What he wants to do is make sure that as part of the New South Wales Nationals team that he delivers the best policies for the people of New England. And that includes the Upper Hunter. Now, Scone's been in the New England for a while, by the way, but it's the Shire of Muswellbrook that has come in, and also what we didn't have of Guida Shire, so Warialda and up to North Star, places like that. Very good support up in the north of the electorate, we believe, and they've just come out of Parkes, of course, which is another Nationals held seat, was held for a long time by Mark Coulton and very faithfully served by Mark Coulton, a fantastic representative for the people of Parkes. Over 50% of the state is in that one electorate.
It's a huge electorate. It's all the way from Gunnerdale all the way past Broken Hill.
Oh, that's right. And it has actually become a little bit bigger in terms of geography. So Jamie Chaffey, who's the Nationals candidate out there, and I tell you what, talk about working hard. I know how many kilometres he's put onto his vehicle, and I don't want to get him into trouble with his accountant, so I won't say. But he's a fantastic candidate, and he will be a fantastic representative.
And he's the former mayor of Gunnedah, so he has a high profile, particularly in that eastern part of the electorate.
Yeah, former mayor of Gunnedah and former chair of the Country Mayors Association. So he has been right around the state, and he really connects with what regional people need and what they want. So coming back to our electorate, though, it's about 10% of the state, so it's also very large. And we will see Mr. Joyce over the next few weeks cover every inch. Nothing's being taken for granted, and the Nationals are certainly wanting to make sure that we win, because we know that if we don't, then we will see resources stripped out of our region, and we will not see a decent return for what is taken away. We saw that when Labor came into government last time, and we don't want to see that happen again. It's time to get the ledger back in the black for us.
The big thing, of course, is Laura Hughes is really gunning for this seat, and she says she needs about 1 in 7 of the new voters to swing to Labor to take the seat. She has said she's serious about Labor taking New England, even though they haven't done so since 1913. So it's certainly been a while. One aspect that I do know that some people have certainly been relaying, not just to her as she's been speaking to me, but what I've also seen online, has been a lot of voters now are getting very sick and tired of Mr. Joyce constantly talking about intermittent power, regardless of what topics he is supposed to be talking about. He was talking about the tariffs last week, and then he tied that into what he says is intermittent power. And a lot of people are now just getting absolutely sick of it, because that seems to be the only thing that he is focusing on. And he has, of course, had some controversy about bringing misinformation and disinformation about renewable energy. And of course, he's a fervent supporter of nuclear energy, which in itself is a very polarizing policy among a lot of voters. And many that I have seen now, looking at some polling as well as some reaction, they don't want to vote for the coalition, even if some of them have been coalition voters, because they don't want nuclear. They don't think that this policy, which has come out pretty quickly, because pretty quickly over the past few years, they're just not comfortable with a potential government building nuclear reactors. And it seems that Mr. Joyce is just constantly focusing on just intermittent power and nuclear, and not talking about anything else except maybe Dungowan Dam or something. This is an issue that I have seen people are starting to get really fed up with. What can Mr. Joyce really do? What other policies, what other ideas can he bring that won't tie into what he's been focusing on for the past couple of years?
Well, I don't think he's going to change focusing on those things, because what we hear throughout the electorate is that people are sick, and I heard it even last night at a meeting. There's a farmer who, Chatham House rules, I won't name names, but his property is now, because he refused to deal with a wind farm builder, it's going to be compulsorily acquired, and his property is going to be cut in half. He'll have an island on one side of his property that he'll be able to struggle to get to, and he doesn't have any choice about that. So when we see people who are upset about these wind and solar projects, I think that what I prefer to have is somebody who has the courage of their convictions to say, no, I don't agree with this. And everybody's entitled to their opinion about that. But the one thing that you'll never have as a problem from Mr. Joyce is knowing which side of the fence he's on. So I think that many people, even if they don't agree with him, respect the fact that he is showing his hand and he's declaring it. Now, going to nuclear, that is something that has been recently taken on by the Liberal Party, but the Nationals have been talking about this for a long time. I remember being 2019 at a conference and there was a motion carried there that we should investigate nuclear power, the nuclear industry more broadly. So look, for the New South Wales Nationals, it's not a new idea at all. It's something that we have had a long series of conversations and investigations about, and we think it's the right way forward as part of the energy mix. It's interesting to talk about misinformation. I just want to refer to a Meet the Candidates forum that I went to in Singleton last week. So just south of Muswellbrook, where the New England is. It was actually in the Hunter electorate, and I went down there. And again, I'll declare Chatham House rules. We won't mention who it was, but one of the Labor members there, and there were two, there were both currently members and they're candidates in the current election. One of them described to an audience of coal mining community-minded people that they weren't going to be switching off coal, that in fact they had looked into the heart of a coal furnace in Japan and realised in that moment that our coal was so much more valuable to the Japanese than it was to us. So we had to stop burning it here so we could sell it to Japan. Now, there will be those within the Labor Party who will tell you that we need to stop burning coal because the world is on fire and that the climate is failing around us. And people may or may not agree with that. But don't believe for a second that the Labor Party thinks that climate change is why we should stop burning coal here. They believe, and they're quite happy to stand in front of their traditional voter base, coal miners in the Hunter Valley. They will stand in front of them and say that they won't stop coal mining. They will stand in front of them and say that we can't afford to burn our own coal, that we have to ship it overseas because we can make more money out of it that way.
And there's also to try and fend off that potential One Nation vote, which Joel Fitzgibbons had to potentially fight off a big challenge a couple of years ago because One Nation has taken many of those traditional Labor policies and it has been really running with those for, like, depending on whether or not the party is functioning or not, depending on Pauline Hanson's mood and whether she's fighting with her fellow candidates and senators like that. But there is that real potential One Nation-esque populist or traditional Labor vote in that Hunter area, which of course is now part of the New England sector as well.
Yeah, that's right. So the candidate in Hunter for One Nation is Stuart Bonds. I know Stuart. He and I have had a few conversations over the years, and I had a conversation with him last week at this same Meet the Candidates forum. Stuart's a really likeable guy. He's a really sensible guy. I don't agree with much of what One Nation has to say. I think that on most social and moral and ethical policies, they fall really flat. Some of their economics makes a little bit more sense than some others. But when it comes to what's going to be good for the people in the Hunter Valley, there is no doubt that the coal industry in the Hunter, and not just in the Hunter, but also, let's not forget, here in the Gunnedah Basin, the coal industry needs to be there for a long time. And what we need is for the market forces that are bringing that really great quality coal out of our region to be supported. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be taking steps to make sure that we transition to cleaner energy solutions like coal that is better extracted and like nuclear energy. And if you want to have some rooftop solar or if you want other things in the mix, you know, I'm a fan of electricity. I have 3 little kids and believe me, they are not going to use less electricity as they grow older. But you can't say, I want to have the transport industry in Australia decarbonised and then not provide a way to recharge those vehicles overnight. You know, there's the battery policy that's come out now. The problem with that battery policy is economically it doesn't stack up. It doesn't pay itself off. You have to invest about $22,000, $23,000 in your home before a single unit of electricity has entered it. And how long would that take to pay off? It's not something that the burden shouldn't be put on households like that. So we need to look at industrial scale power solutions. Now, some people will argue that we need industrial scale solar and wind and that we need tens of thousands of kilometres of transmission lines, which involves acquiring people's land on a compulsory basis, even when they don't want you to be there. And I'm a big believer that the owner of the land should be able to do what they want with it. You know, if a farmer says, actually, I don't want to farm this anymore, I want to put a wind tower up, as long as they're not disturbing the amenity of their neighbours, I don't really have an issue with that. That's up to them. What I do have an issue with, and what I hear from people all the time, is when other people's land is acquired without any means for them to fight that decision, and they don't get a choice about it, and they're offered some money that is at a set rate, and they don't get to choose. I don't think that's fair. If we invest in more energy dense, more centralised electricity, things like gas, things like the existing coal, things like nuclear in the future, then we can use the transmission lines that we have. We can place that energy closer to the centres that we need, and we can make sure that the energy is going to support existing populations and existing industries. Now, I think on balance that's a better plan. It doesn't mean that I completely disagree with everything that's said by the other side, but on balance, I think that that's the way we should approach this.
We're almost at the end of tonight's show, but the one thing I do certainly want to ask you is, it seems that there's also a lot of conflict regarding how much the nuclear policy would be costing. We've had figures ranging from $230 billion up to $600 billion. Then we also have this Liberals Against Nuclear internal group, which has been really starting to push against their own party, and they've had their own studies that have been released. Of course, you can take like where they're coming from and what their agenda would be, but they've also highlighted issues around not enough water for many of these nuclear plants. 200 gigalitres has been floated about as a figure, so farmers could potentially have that water taken away. And as what you've been saying, some of these nuclear sites could also have compulsory land acquisitions at the same time. Then we have the controversies about when exactly will this nuclear plants even get online, the designs of them, where exactly will they be providing jobs, mostly in construction, but then afterwards. There's been all this confusion and concern, especially as we have politicians like Barnaby Joyce going against the CSIRO, who have done many of these studies, and as soon as they release a study that goes against what he's been saying, he can just wants to dismiss it as as absolutely wrong, nothing, or anyone who speaks against some of his policies is nothing more than lefty greenies, if you know what I mean. So there's this all this contradictory information that's starting to come through, ranging from nuclear will be so much cheaper for us, lowering power prices. Then at the same time, we've got another study saying that it would cost 4 times more than renewables and would actually make our power prices go up. How can we just clear through all this fog to actually get the proper costings, the proper projections and all that? Because this is a policy that the coalition is really pushing through, and a lot of people are just not buying it.
So I think that when you're talking about costings for these big energy projects, there are 2 things really to take into account. What's the cost for the person who's actually going to be paying their power bill? And we know that under the Labor government, who promised to bring that down by $250 a year, it went up by 3 times that amount.
Was it $275 power relief or something like that?
Something like that, okay. So, but everybody, again, how does it make you feel? Nobody feels good about their power bill right now. Nobody feels good about the fact that we have had an economy that's pretty busted. Nobody feels good about the fact that housing security is an issue. So I think people know with their gut that whatever we're doing now isn't the right way to go and that something has to change. Now, the other things that we don't really talk about enough with the costs of solar and wind versus nuclear is what's the cost in terms of the amount of land that's used? What's the cost in terms of how many electrons do you have to sacrifice in order to transmit the power from one place to another? What's the cost in terms of our social fabric? And why is it that the majority of people who live in the cities are using power that they've outsourced the production of to, you guessed it, the regions? So I don't think if there was a fair appraisal done of what are we taking out of our regions and sending to our cities, that you would come back with any sort of cost other than the people who live here in the New England are getting a raw deal as a result of that. Certainly, I believe that there is room for a bigger conversation about our energy mix, and I don't think that we should be shutting nuclear out of that. The rest of the world certainly isn't. So we're seeing some fantastic developments in technology. China and France both progressing in nuclear fusion, and we've seen just in the past couple of weeks some really interesting progress there. Australia has always been a technologically ambitious country. We have led the charge on being able to reduce people's famine and bring people out of disease for a long time. And if we continue down this path of recklessly decarbonising our industries too quickly, particularly our agriculture industry, then we're not going to be able to continue to lead the way there. We need to say, the technology will provide the answers that we need, but we need to be ambitious about it. And that includes saying over a 60-year timeline, we'd have to replace some of those solar and wind assets 3 times, whereas a nuclear station, even on the current technologies, would probably last at least that long, if not longer. And the newer technologies, and there'll probably be something even more interesting and even more energy dense than nuclear that will come eventually. If we tie ourselves to only one way of producing our electricity, then we're going to suffer for that. We saw that happen in Germany, and we have seen that happen in other places that have gone down this path. We don't need to learn from our own mistakes. We can see the mistakes that other people have made and say, you know what, we need to be more ambitious than just solar and wind.
Daniel Gillett, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much.
And in news to hand, the AEC has confirmed there are 7 candidates running for the seat of New England. Natasha Ledger has been listed as an independent, as well as right-wing populist candidate in the form of Todd Juzau, who is running for the Trumpets of Patriots group led by Clive Palmer. All candidates now have until May 3rd to convince voters that they should be the person to represent them in the House of Representatives, and there's still just over 3 weeks until polling day. Finally tonight, opposition leader Peter Dutton might need to work on his kick after he booted a Sharon and injured a cameraman while on the campaign trail this week. The footy struck the cameraman's camera, causing a gash to his head, and is now being compared to when the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison tackled a kid while playing soccer during the last election campaign. Despite the blood, the cameraman wasn't seriously injured. That's the program for this week. I'm Daniel Pizarro. Thank you so much for your company. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you again next Friday as this election campaign continues. Bye for now.